In this video, we will talk about how to find the domain and the range from a graph. So as a reminder, the domain is simply all of the possible x values that a graph can take on, and the range is all of the possible y values that a graph can take on. So I have 6 examples for us to work through here. Let's check out this first graph. Let's say we have this line right here, and we want to know what's the domain and what's the range of this graph. So the domain, we said that's the x values. So when we talk about x values, we're talking about the left and the right direction of the graph. And we're just asking ourselves, is there any restriction on how far left or how far right the graph could go? Well, we can see this line, it's just going to go on and on and on forever in this direction. So as we're going left, there's no restriction. It could just go more and more and more left. And similarly, it's going up and to the right in this direction. So as we're going right, there's no restriction on the x either. It can just increase higher and higher and higher in the right direction. So for the domain, let's write D, we would say that it's allowed to range from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. So there's no restriction on the possible x values. And by the way, when we write negative infinity and positive infinity, we use these open parentheses as opposed to a bracket to indicate that we can't actually ever reach negative infinity, and we can never actually reach positive infinity. So that's why we use these parentheses. So that's the domain. Now for the range, we're talking about the possible y values. So now we're thinking in the vertical direction, so up and down. Is there any restriction on the possible y values? Well, again, we said this line is just going to keep going up and to the right forever and ever. So there's no restriction on how far up the graph can go. And similarly, this line is just going in this direction forever and ever. So there's no limit on how low the graph can go. So the range, we would also say, let's write R, it's also allowed to range from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. So there's no restrictions on either the x values or the y values. So this is our answer on this one. All right, let's check out this next example. We have this graph. Let's first figure out the domain. So remember, we're looking to the left and to the right. Is there any restriction on the x values? So we can see that this graph just goes up and to the right forever and up and to the left forever. So as we're going right and as we're going left, there's no restriction on what the x values can be. So for the domain, the x values will say they can range from negative infinity to positive infinity. For the range, remember, we're focusing on the up and the down, so the vertical direction. So we can see that as this graph continues to just go up in each direction, there's no restriction on how high it can go. So there's no restriction on the positive values of the y, but we can see as we go down this vertical direction, we abruptly stop at this point right here, which is 1, 2, 3. So y is not allowed to be less than 3. So here's how we can write the range. We'll say it can go from 3 with a square bracket because it's allowed to be 3, so we're including 3, and it can go all the way up to positive infinity. So that's our answer for this one. All right, let's check out this graph that we have right here. First, let's find the domain. So that's the left and the right direction. We can see that as we go left, we abruptly stop at this point right here, 1, 2. So x is not allowed to be less than 2. But we can see that both of these lines extend in this direction forever, so there's no limit on the positive x values. So for the domain, we would say it ranges from 2, remember we use a bracket to indicate that 2 is included, from 2 all the way to positive infinity. Now for the range, that's where we focus on the vertical direction. We can see that both of these lines, again, they're just going up and out forever and ever. We can see there's no restriction on how low the graph could go or how high the graph could go. So for the range, we're just going to say negative infinity to positive infinity. So that's our answer for this one. All right, let's check out this graph. First, let's identify the domain. So remember, we're looking to the left and to the right. Is there any restriction on how far left or right the graph can go? No, it doesn't appear so. So x, the domain, is allowed to range from negative infinity to positive infinity. And now for the range, that's when we're thinking about the vertical direction, up and down. We can see that as we go down, both of these lines just go down and down forever, so there's no restriction on how low they can go, but we can see that when we're looking in this vertical direction up, it abruptly stops at this point right here. So 1, 2. So y is not allowed to be higher than 2. So for our range, we'll say it can range from negative infinity all the way up to positive 2. And we'll put a bracket right here to indicate that 2 is also included in the range. So that's our answer for this one. All right, let's check out this one. This one's a little different. We have a circle, and we want to know what's the domain and the range. So the domain, we said that's the left and the right direction. How far left and how far right are we allowed to go? Well, if we're going left, we stop abruptly right here. So we can imagine this line right here. That's x is -2. And in the right direction, if we're going this way, we abruptly stop right here at this line, which is x is +2. So the domain, we would say, ranges from -2 to +2. Now the range, that's the vertical direction, so up and down. How far up is it allowed to go? Well, we can see it stops right here at a y value of 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's not going any higher than 4. And we can also see that it stops right here at a value of y equals 0. So it's ranging from 0 to 4 in the vertical direction. So we'll say the range is 0 to 4. And again, we're using brackets to indicate that 0 and 4 are included in that range. So that's our answer for this one. All right, let's try one last example. Let's say we have this graph. Let's first find the domain. So remember we said the domain is the left and the right direction. Are there any restrictions on how far left and right this graph can go? Well, for this one, we can see that the only x values that appear are this straight line right here, which is at x is 1, 2, 3, 4, -4. So right here, I'll write x is -4. For all of these values, x is -4. And similarly, in this right direction, we can see that the only x value that occurs is an x value of 1 right here. X is 1. So all of these values on this line are x is 1. So for the domain for this one, what we can do is, since there's only 2 x values that are allowed, we can write curly brackets and we can say -4 and 1 to indicate that this isn't a range. These are just the actual x values that are allowed. So -4 and 1. Now for the range, we said we're focusing on the vertical direction, so up and down. So we can see that when we're going down, there's no restriction on how far down we can go. And similarly, there's no restriction on how far up we can go or how high we can go. But we'll notice that both of these lines have open circles. So when you have an open circle, it means that particular value is not included. So we can see that they both have an open circle at a y value of 2. So 2 is actually not included. So for the range for this one, we'll say it can go from -infinity up to 2 with a parentheses to indicate 2 is not included. That's not allowed as the range. And then we union that with 2, again, in open parentheses to indicate 2 is not allowed all the way up to +infinity. So that's our answer for this one.